Sawubona. I'm Dr. Linda James Myers. I am the author of Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. And I'm so pleased to be here with you to read this text to you. You know, so many years ago, my beloved Dr. John Henry Clark told me I really needed to do an audio rendition of this book so people could listen to me read it. And I've been feeling so bad for so long that wasn't done. So I am so excited today to share with you a reading of Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. I'm going to be reading the text from beginning to end, but I want you to make sure as you listen that you have a sense of the social context from which this book emerged some 35 years ago. It's still relevant today, and out of it emerges a theory of optimal psychology, as well as a psychoeducational, psychotherapeutic approach that is so necessary for the healing of our people and humanity in general. Starting with the preface, then, I'm going to begin reading and talk about what you'll find, actually be sharing what you'll find in the book. The preface begins, I feel within myself a soul as immense as the world, as immense as the world, a master being forced to adopt the humility of a slave. I feel within myself a soul as immense as the world, a master being forced to adopt the humility of a slave. This is a quotation from Frantz Fanon, who talked about the struggles of being a Black person in a white supremacist global community. In the pages that follow, we shall journey through the process that articulates something of the worldview and circumstances from which this statement of noted Black psychiatrist Frantz Fanon could be made. In Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology, our intent is to foster understanding and dialogue around which greater awareness and self-knowledge can be attained for the well-being of us all and the planet. Designed to compare and contrast the predominant worldview from which we in the United States are socialized with an Afrocentric alternative, an optimal conceptual system will be identified and defined for use as the basis of developing and articulating the optimal psychology. Based on experiential knowledge of reality, on a positive belief derived in part through the use of reason, and on the teachings of ancient Africans, we know that everlasting peace and happiness are achievable. The purpose of this text is to provide a synthesis of thought and opportunity for maximizing positivity of experience and unifying opposites, so that we may make more informed conscious decisions about the construction of our reality. Part one of this book will briefly outline the resurgence of an Afrocentric worldview and detail a model of optimal psychology. Part two will focus on why an Afrocentric psychology is so desperately needed in modern times, and on the answers it can provide. Part three will examine the method and functioning of an optimal psychology, which does not remove free will choices about our current assumptions. Rather, optimal psychology may best be understood when described in the context of the suboptimal, allowing choices to be made more consciously. Anyone interested in empowerment and in more fully understanding him or herself will find this book of value. as a basis for examining their inner selves and their worldviews, conceptual systems, students of comparative studies, Black, African, African American studies, women's studies, ethics, psychology, and all of the social and physical sciences and the humanities will also benefit. Those seeking positions of management or leadership and those occupying such positions owe it to themselves and the rest of us to become knowledgeable of this subject matter. This book is dedicated to the future of our past and to the future of our future. Special acknowledgement is given to the ancestors, to my family of origin, my family of creation and extension, to Ikenna, Ta, my sons who have so beautifully prompted my growth, and to those special students who have understood and joined me in the ascension of human consciousness. To all, namaste. I have the honor to be your most humble servant. Peace be unto you. In the first chapter, we start with the evolution and expansion of psychology. And so we begin with the introduction to an idea. I want to share with you the way through which I have come to see the world. The perspective requires that I address you personally because of two basic tenets. One, self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge, otherwise known as epistemology. And two, human and spiritual networks, intuology, provide the process through which we will achieve our goals. All of the things we do, we create or construct concepts, rituals, discourse, enjoyment, and so on. The transformative process of self-creation occurs as we revision ourselves, grow, and understand the multidimensionality of being, knowing, and experiencing. This text is designed for your participation in a self-discovery process of research, self-affirmation, through which a new way of seeing that will result in greater clarity. The process through which we shall go may prove difficult, for it requires change, movement of our cognitions or thinking from one system of conceiving to another. If at some point you are not consciously aware of two mutually exclusive, antithetical, self-consistent conceptual systems, then perhaps you will have mistakenly interpreted one conceptual system from the perspective or assumptions of another. A conceptual system is the structure of philosophical assumptions and principles on which a way of viewing the world is based. Of the conceptual systems we shall examine, one is fragmented and assumes that the transphysical and physical, or spiritual and material, are separate. The other is holistic, assuming the unity of spirit and matter, their oneness. In the United States of America, most of us have been socialized into the former conceptual system and consequent way of viewing the world, while the latter is characteristic of an Afrocentric worldview. In order to understand the human consequences of each, we shall examine the predominant American and traditional African worldviews, examine them in terms of their conceptual systems, and articulate a psychology that evolves from the process. This work represents the outcome of a desire to know and understand, of having known and understood. It is part of an ongoing process within an infinity of knowledge that is reflected in both an individual's and a people's experience. It explains a history of love, of hope, courage, and strength, of transforming and transcending. A product of the same spirit that prompted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to say, I have been to the mountaintop. This work is designed to assist you on your way to the mountaintop so that together we may see the other side, for it is an offering of peace to my people. Who are my people? Going back far enough into our ancestries, into their ancestries, back to the beginnings of human culture and civilization. My people of African descent are all people. Perhaps many, not wanting to acknowledge themselves as African descendants, will exclude themselves because to them the idea of segmenting their histories seems natural and sensible. According to their way of viewing the world, the idea of identifying with the origins of humankind is unreasonable and far-fetched. In the West, this segmented worldview predominates and predisposes adherents to internalize at one level or another a belief that anything African is inferior. On the other hand, there are those who will at last identify with and embrace that missing part needed to make their knowledge of themselves more complete. The worldview we shall seek to understand requires that we be holistic, utilizing the full breadth, height, and depth of knowledge available to us. I describe it as Afrocentric because it originated in Africa, was evident among ancient Aztec and Mayan cultures, and now exists throughout the world, particularly among peoples of color, including contemporary Native American cultures. The psychology we shall extrapolate from this worldview is described as optimal because it is structured to yield maximally positive experience in a holistic way. The question arises, can I be so arrogant as to suggest that I have identified a way of viewing the world that can yield a psychology that is the most satisfactory or favorable in degree, that is optimal? No, without giving the specific content and rationale, I cannot. So an objective of this work is to provide a cultural, historical, and personal frame of reference that in defining the optimal considers the whole and utilizes it as the basis of reasoning. The intellectual imperialism of Western patriarchy has proven to be viciously intolerant of any perspective that breaks the bonds of its conceptual incarceration. In the Aquarian age, the time has come to articulate an alternative reality for the well-being of us all, because the dynamic tension within the current predominant worldview accommodates self and social destruction. For those who would value everlasting peace and happiness, there is a way, more optimal than others, of viewing the world. While this knowledge is as old as humankind itself, in the West, its study and pursuit are not common, not a conscious common process. In fact, in the West, it is commonly believed that the achievement of everlasting peace and happiness would be a human improbability, if not impossibility, and most certainly a subject unsuitable for scientific investigation. In the West, the subject is most often considered to be beyond the purview of science, plagued with conceptual and methodological difficulties surrounding issues as basic as what is happiness? Is it relative? Is it arbitrary? At the same time, other cultures have viewed peace as not only possible, but natural and able to be achieved. All worldviews are accessible through an individual's consciousness. So through examination of our current worldview, in contrast to optimal psychology, this book will assist you in rediscovering your full consciousness and introduce you to a way of understanding human behavior. The optimal frame of reference we shall use is the basis for increasing self-knowledge and will deepen your understanding of others and the universe. So, welcome. I'm so excited that we're going to have this conversation with Dr. Julius Garvey. I am Dr. Linda James Myers, author of Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. And we're here today to talk about that text which I have been reading. And Dr. Garvey, thank you. We're so excited to have you here for carrying on this wonderful discussion.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me to be here because, your book is a favorite of mine, which I read, I don't know, 25 years ago or something like that, and, digested it. And it's been, a guiding star, shall we say, in terms of psychology and how one looks at the mind. So, I'm very, very interested in going over this with you to dig a little bit deeper, shall we say,
Absolutely.
and unfold, what you're saying at that time, and if, in some sense, updating it. And if I can add or comment, that would be a plus from my perspective, because I'm sure it'll be a learning experience for me as well as for your audience.
Yes,
So,
yes.
one of the first things, of course, is your quotation from Frantz Fanon, and Frantz Fanon was a famous Caribbean, I think, Martinican psychologist who was involved in the Algerian War back in the 50s, and he was looking at that whole business of how does one deal with the colonial masters, shall we say, in terms of a post-colonial mindset, and how do we face each other, the colonizer and the previously colonized, in a post-revolutionary situation. And of course, being a psychiatrist, he understood that, really, it was a mindset that had to be changed in order to be able to approach each other. And, I can't quote it, but basically, as he was saying, he felt constricted, by the conceptual system that had been promoted by the colonizer. In that case, of course, France, both in terms of his own country, Martinique, as well as Algeria. And of course, the response from the colonizer in terms of the Algerians wanting the freedom was horrendous in terms of its destructive capacity, and of course, now we can talk about the civilian casualties that at that time the French created. I mean, they were quite vicious, de Gaulle, etc. They were quite vicious in their colonial war. And, as he said, I mean, he had, how should I put it, a persona, a sense of himself that was expansive and whole. And there was this colonial, if you will, conceptual system confining him into a situation where he would be nothing better than a slave. And, interestingly, it reminded me also of my father's statement in 1937 that we must liberate our minds from mental slavery.
Absolutely.
Because, while others can free the mind, the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. And then you go deeper also into that whole concept of Carter G. Woodson back in 1933. So here we are in the 30s, the miseducation of the Negro. And his statement that if the Negro has the same educational system as those who have enslaved him and Jim Crowed him, then the oppressor, has no problem in oppressing him and telling him what to do in terms of his activity. And the oppressor won't even have to tell him because his mind has been captured. He'll automatically, as he said, find his right place. He'll go to the back door, and if there's no back door, he'll make a back door. So, this is the situation that we're in.
Absolutely.
So how do we get out of it?
Well, that's absolutely why I chose this particular quote from Fanon, because he is saying, I feel in myself a soul as immense as the world, and master being forced to adopt the humility of a slave. And that was true then and before, and it's still true now. But I think what optimal psychology does is it suggests to us, I do have that soul as immense as the world, but it's not a master that's forcing me to adopt the humility of a slave. It's a captor. We must stop referring to our slave captors as masters. They are absolutely not. And so part of the shift in consciousness that I think Fanon was reaching for, he was at an earlier time and didn't quite make that shift because of the social context of, in part, maybe French colonization versus British. The French do it well. So you're not human, you're not cultured. Even today, if you go to France and don't speak French, they're kind of looking down their nose. But that consciousness of being less than is so alive and well today, Julius. We have so many Black people who have internalized oppression and really suffer from what psychologists call racial trauma or racial stress, because they haven't yet shifted from feeling bad about being the victimized and began to point a finger at the victimizer, who's the real problem. So I thought it was justifiable to use this quote. And also, I love your reference to Carter G. Woodson. His prophetic teaching was just that, prophetic. Unfortunately, it's kind of like, you kind of wish he wasn't so right, but in actuality, he nailed it. And so that's why we need to have this conversation. And so happy to be having it with you to really help people see how we have been totally brainwashed. Our minds have been controlled. We have to liberate our minds from that mental slavery, as your father talked about.
Well, as you say, our minds are incarcerated within the pedagogy, if you will, and the systems of miseducation, the economic and the social systems of the group basically has enslaved us and continues to oppress us. And this has produced, you can use different words, but what we call the post-slavery traumatic syndrome, or the post-slavery syndrome. And it affects, not only the mind, but because the mind controls the body, it affects the body as well in terms of illness. So we not only have mental illnesses, based on this, okay, we can say miseducation, but I guess we need a word. I'm not sure if this is a word, misenculturation, if you will, because we've been enculturated or indoctrinated into the conceptual beliefs of the system that oppresses us. So we have the same mindset. So we ending up oppressing ourselves and oppressing each other. Yes. And this is like, the snake with the tail in its mouth. It goes round and round and round, and you never get out of that particular circle, unless you break out. And again, we come back to the necessity to break out, because it affects our mind, and then it affects our physical health, and clearly then it affects the actions in terms of how we see each other, how we see ourselves, how we see each other, how we treat each other, and we end up with different societal ills, like black on black violence, like male-female violence, gender violence, etc. So a lot of these things that manifest within our community sociologically are related to this oppressive system that has captured our minds and then is playing itself out individually and collectively in terms of our communities, in terms of this um, um, negative social expressions. And then we end up incarcerated in jails, or we end up with police coming and shooting us down on the streets and so on for the slightest, misdemeanor. So there again, we have this circle, that we're trapped in. Because of the miseducation and because it has affected our minds negatively, we misbehave, and then we misbehave, then the society comes down on us like a ton of bricks, and we're incarcerated or killed or whatever it is, and we never get out of that particular trap. I mean, we need a way out, Linda.
Yes, and so we found a way out, optimal psychology, because the reality is, as long as we keep buying into our miseducation and missocialization, there is no way out. The people who created the conceptual system, the mindset, there's no way out for them. So if they created it to benefit themselves, it's certainly not going to benefit the people whose oppression benefits them. So I just am excited, because when we begin to think about how do we break out of this cycle, out of this circle, we have to free our minds. And the way we have to free our minds is through self-knowledge. Know thyself. And the self we need to know isn't this self that has an identity and worth based on looks and income and position and education and where you live and the kind of car you drive. That's not who you really are. That's who the chapters of your forebears want you to believe you are. Why? Because as long as you believe that, or you think that way, they have control over you, because they control the economic system that is going to determine your value and your opportunity to access those things. So the system instituted during chattel enslavement was so effective. It's alive and well today. And until we begin to understand at the level of what I call cultural deep structure, how that system works, we're never going to break out of that cycle. But the good news is we've discovered, and we've written about, not just me, but many have written about how that system works. But from a psychological vantage point, it's most problematized because even the people we rely on, the psychologists, if you've been trained in mainstream Western psychology, then you don't really have any answers relative to liberating yourself from the stress of racism or systemic racism. And therefore, the message to you is likely, oh, learn to cope. No, coping is going to create those problems you just mentioned, Dr. Garvey, the stress, the hypertension, the diabetes, all of those things that tend to plague our communities because we're trying to cope in an unnatural, toxic, pathological environment that, by virtue of its nature, can easily wreck every aspect of our being, from our physical body to our psychological, emotional, spiritual, our relationships. But the good news is we can be healed by going back to the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of our African ancestors who nailed it way, 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 way back and created a society, a culture built upon that knowledge that lasted over 6,000 years.
You know, Linda, what to me is also very interesting is, while the fact is that this oppressive system, or this system, is being used to oppress us, it is the only system that the oppressor knows. So the oppressor is a victim of this oppressive system as well as us. And, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the people within that system don't recognize it. But, and I think it's important, you know, for us to understand this, that and look at what has happened within that system, where it is at the present time. If you look, for example, at two world wars, and the Korean War and the Vietnamese War, and Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen and now, of course, we're talking about the Ukraine, etc. 100 million people have been killed. Let's say we include, the enslavement of us and the genocide of the Jewish and other people that were non-Aryan during the Second World War. I mean, this is, monstrous. And you also look at the death of the different species of plants and animals, and how we're replacing, with plants with all kinds of genetically modified things. We're replacing our agriculture with all kinds of chemicals, which are poisoning, us, poisoning the groundwater, poisoning the water we drink, poisoning the seas. I mean, there is so much negativity that has come out of that system. And of course, now it's global warming and climate change. So when we look at that system, I mean, it's damaging to us, but it's damaging to everybody who adopts it. And
absolutely,
this is a Eurocentric system that has come out of Europe. And of course, has committed pretty much genocide here in the North American continent, as well as places like Australia. And I shouldn't say North America, North, South, Central America, and Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Committed, a genocide in many of these places. So it is an unhealthy system. I would say up and down. And you look at the inequality within the system. You have these billionaires strutting around. You have these corporations with billions and billions of dollars. And yet still you have homeless people on the streets and so on and so forth. So clearly, it is a suboptimal system for the people who accept it or are forced into it. And it's been around at least for 500 years, or we can go all the way back to the Greeks if we want. But as you're saying, having pointed that out, we can go to the other system, which is more ancient than the Eurocentric or the European system, which is the Afrocentric system, which is based on our civilizations, our now valid civilizations, Kush and Kemet and Nubia. Of course, Kemet was the classical one, as well as Ethiopia. And so tell us how you see that as the basis for the optimal psychological system.
Absolutely, because to the extent we've all been socialized into the worldview of our ancestors' captors, and our ancestors' captors have a history of behaving in a very particular way, unique to them and not generalizable to the totality of human populations. We have a small, actually a minority of people having a mindset that has prompted them not only to discover things fully utilized by other people, claim them as their own, and wage war against those people who were on the lands they discovered, and end up creating a history that has them identified as the ones who were the aggressor, and the people who have actually been the aggressor become the heroes. That mindset that does this kind of mental gymnastics where I, as the victimizer, become the hero, and you as the victimized become the problem or the felon, is just the norm of Western thinking. And we call that way of thinking a function of a set of assumptions about the world and the way things work that has been so pervasive. So to the extent I am cut off from my spiritual aspect of being, because we know through traditional African cultural worldviews, as well as modern science, quantum mechanics and neuroscience, we know reality is essentially a spiritual phenomenon. So being, if you cut people off from that, you cut them off from that which would then serve as a spiritual and moral anchor. So in our ancestral tradition as African people, we've always understood from the beginning, at least from the earliest writings in our history, of the importance of Ma'at, or the embodiment of truth, of justice, of righteousness. And that became foundational, not only for how we saw ourselves and one another, but how we conducted ourselves socially. So to the extent that's been a part of our foundation, I argue that it's that mindset, which I call an optimal mindset, which accounts for our being able to not only survive 250 years of chattel enslavement, caste enslavement, but also come out of it thriving and being the moral and spiritual leaders of this nation for freedom and justice for all. But as you think about the ways in which that fragmented mindset that is separating the spiritual aspect of being from the material aspect of being, it's always functioned in the same way. And what's sad is that when we take on that mindset, we function in that same way. Racism wasn't a function of white people upon first encountering Black people, seeing them as inferior. No, they saw them as what? Erastus said, oh, these are highly developed, highly cultured people. It's only later when the determination was made that we need to kidnap and traffic these people to the Americas to build our economic worth that racism becomes predominant in the way we define reality and see the world. So the system, the mindset that would allow us to see other human beings as less than human, that would allow us to kidnap millions of young Africans and traffic them to the Americas for material wealth. That mindset is alive and well today, and we see it with billionaires who are quite happy during this pandemic to have quadrupled their wealth, while children have not gotten the care they needed, the food they needed, the shelter they needed, much less the education. So that fragmented mindset sets human beings up to behave badly at a level that is almost incomprehensible. And that's why it's so important we understand that mindset. I call it the suboptimal mindset, as well as the mindset of our ancestors, which is referred to as optimal, because from an optimal mindset, we know our worth as human beings is intrinsic. I'm worthy simply because I am, because of who and what I am, as the expression of an infinite creative life force. I'm connected to the source of all good and the source of all creation.
I think that's important to juxtapose the two, and it is absolutely correct that the original understanding of who we are as human beings came about obviously from the original human beings who are us as a people. Let's say it's 200,000 years ago in Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, that area, the Olduvai Gorge, as the archaeologists tell us. And of course, with the first civilizations that came out of the Nile Valley. And, it always has been that we have seen ourselves as a spiritual people. And the spiritual people in the sense that is our essence. And we have a mind and we have a body. The mind is what connects, if you will, the spirit to the body. And when we speak of mind in that sense, it is an expression of spirit. And when we speak of spirit, it's not just an energy, but it's a consciousness. And this is where I think the true difference is, or the basic difference is, between the so-called Western mindset, or suboptimal, if you will, and the African-centered mindset, is that we put consciousness as basic to reality. In other words, absolute reality is unconditioned consciousness, which is the basis of the universe and all of the things that have been created over time. Now, it's also, I think, important to establish the fact that consciousness doesn't work on its own. Consciousness and energy are like two sides of the same coin. And of course, in terms of, let's say, India, they speak of it as Shiva and Shakti, Shiva being the consciousness and Shakti being the energy. And of course, in terms of us as the Nile Valley people who spread this understanding around, we speak of it from the perspective of Amun and Ra. And then we also include Ptah, because while Amun is the consciousness and Ra is the energy, well, what is the energy transporting apart from pure consciousness? Well, it has to be transporting something, which is information. And that is who and what Ptah is. So that is the essence of what created us, and that is the essence of who we are, because we do believe that we were created in the image of God. And of course, we have that in the temples, on the walls of the temples in Kemet and so on, where we see the images of divine symbols breathing breath into the human. So we know that we're made in the divine image. So we know that our essence is, unconditioned consciousness, energy, and information, which we can call wisdom if you're able to access it, your own awareness. So this is extremely fundamental. Whereas when we look at the suboptimal, it's based on matter as being primary, and everything has been reduced to matter. And only those things which you can measure either by weighing it, or determining its length or its speed, or one of those dimensions, in terms of space-time. Only that is being considered as reality, whereas as matter is a really small part of the whole, shall we say, cosmic presence. And they know this. I mean, most of cosmic presence is space, 99.9% of it, not matter. But yet still, we have a reductionist system, which is Eurocentric, which has gone to the extreme of reducing everything to matter. So there's no answer then. There's no spiritual answer to anything. And of course, what has been called spiritual has come to mean something that is outside of self. Yes. God is up there. And salvation is over there in heaven, which you may get to when you die or something of that nature. It has nothing to do with everyday living. Whereas, as you know, in Kemet, it said, as above, so below, meaning that heaven is here, it's not somewhere else. And you have to create that heaven in terms of your day-to-day practice. And in order to do that, you had an optimal psychology. Can you tell us more about self-knowledge? Because that's our sticking point, is that we don't know this, and we don't know how to access it.
That's absolutely true, because we don't know who and what self is. Mm-hmm. And when we begin to know self as an expression of an infinite light force, almost you can trace from ancient classical African civilization to contemporary African civilizations to the Americas, the knowing of, what did they say? They said we are becoming. Being meaning spirit, becoming meaning manifestation of spirit, and closing with the conscious realization of our union with the divine. We're here for a purpose, which is being, spiritual being, becoming consciously in union with the divinity, which we are. So that's the knowledge of self we're pursuing, not from the Western worldview, which is fragmented. So self from an African-centered view is multidimensional. Myself isn't separate from my ancestors or those who came before, future generations, all of nature, and my community. So that multidimensional self is the self that I want to gain knowledge of. And as you pointed out, Dr. Garvey, the reality in the Western mindset is myself is my individual form, and there may be a spiritual aspect to being, but it's out there. I'm down here, and even to communicate with that force, I need an intermediary. I need a pope, I need a minister, I need a pastor, somebody to allow me access to that divinity. But our ancestors said, no, that is within you. And it's interesting because even if you look at Christian sacred texts, the first teaching of Jesus the Christ was the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He didn't say the kingdom of heaven's in the sky. He said it's at hand. Anything that's at hand is right here, right now. So what we have to learn to do is shift our consciousness to the consciousness of the people who wrote the Bible, which tend to be overlooked, but they were African people, and it was their thoughts that were being expressed. And their knowing wasn't knowing through counting and measuring. Their knowing was through symbolic imagery and rhythm. They understood everything is a representation or symbolic of this divine force and our connection to it and our relationship to it. And the Western mindset is, oh, everything is out there, material, and we know it by being able to count, measure, and manipulate it. And ultimately, our goal is to control and dominate it. Mm-hmm. So the Western mindset is one that suggests they have a better idea than what the divine infinite energy had structured, what nature had structured. And so there's been this constant competition. And the competition has landed us, as you had mentioned earlier, with holes in the ozone, depletion of the resources, the air's toxic, the food is carcinogenic. Oh my goodness, what have we done? And I just want our listeners to know what we've done is we've followed the wrong prescription, the wrong mindset, the wrong set of assumptions about the world, reality, and the way things work. And self-knowledge is so important because when we pursue self-knowledge, we begin to realize we create reality. Reality isn't something out there existing, except for our participation in its creation. And once I begin to know that, once I begin to learn that, then I can create that which I think. Right now, most of us don't create that which we think. We create and replicate that's which we've been told. And unfortunately, there's billion-dollar industries out there whose job it is to tell us what we want, what's good, what's of value, what's going to make us feel good. And until we step back and withdraw and begin to see how things are really working, we're going to be again caught up in that menticide, that system of controlling our thinking and our culture. But all we have to do is stop for a moment, step back, realize who we are, where we are, how we got here, and where we want to go and create that which we think. What did your father say? Coming out of that mental bondage and knowing only we can liberate ourselves.
True enough. I want to follow with another one of my favorites that my father said, and you just touched upon it. God and nature first made us what we are, and then out of our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. Follow always that great law, and God, the sky and nature will be our measure, and eternity, our law. I mixed it up a little bit, but basically that's what he said in terms of our ability to create ourselves. And of course, the motto of his organization was one God, one aim, one destiny. And what this is saying is that with one God, our aim is to manifest that God here on planet Earth, which creates the heaven, which is the destiny for us to create. And of course, we do it with one love. But it's our creative ability to do that. And of course, our creative ability is in our essence. It's not in the mindset, because the mindset has been indoctrinated, shall we say, by the cultural mores that you have mentioned. We've been programmed. And much of the educational system is one of learning what's in the textbooks and what has been said by other people, not for us to develop our critical thinking and our own creativity to deal with the problems that we face. So that you find that the problems are being repeated over and over and over again without any real solutions. Even when the problem is studied, you don't really have a solution. I mean, let's talk about the war on drugs. Well, there's been a war on drugs, but what has happened with drugs? They've just proliferated. The war on poverty. What about the war on poverty? They've not solved poverty. You know, poverty has proliferated, and there's the greatest inequality of wealth ever in terms of humankind. So the system does not have it within itself to correct itself. And I think that's what's very, very important for anyone who is struggling in terms of looking at the system and being uncomfortable within the system and wondering how they can find a way within the system. You cannot find a way within the system because the system is based on a misunderstanding of the extent of human nature. It's based on the physical characteristics of the human being and the sensory ability to perceive, and then the intelligence of the mind to be able to assemble what one has perceived through the physical ability to perceive sensations, so that it's all physical and it's all superficial. And then there's the mental component that puts that together. And, you know, because it is a misunderstanding and an illusion, the individual always feels dissatisfied. And whatever you have based on this physical perspective, you always want more because you can never be fully satisfied. And that's the basis of greed. You know, you have this desire for something, and I think, you know, Freud expressed it, and you need to deal with this as a psychologist, but this is a pleasure principle. You can call it the pleasure principle, or you can call it the desire, you know, to be fulfilled. But you see the way to fulfillment as obtaining something that's external to you. So you're always chasing something that's external to you to be fulfilled, to find your happiness, and so that you can be at peace with yourself and the world. And then you end up chasing these things. And you may be satisfied with one thing at this point in time. Let's say that, you know, you're a young man, you may be satisfied with this pretty girl, but then you see another pretty girl and you run over to that pretty girl, you know, or this pretty girl over time that you marry, she's no longer as pretty as she was. So you lose your desire, or somebody takes her away and she sees somebody else. So there you are, you know, again, chasing your tail within the system that reduces everything to materialism and reduces the human being to basically a physical machine with desires and the intellect that satisfies these desires. But even in satisfaction of these desires, it is never complete because it's never holistic. And therefore, you can never get satisfaction within that system. Absolutely. You have to have a system that understands the human being completely. In other words, the human being is more than a human animal. The human being has the essential conscious awareness of the source. And we can call the source, you know, God. We can call the source the quantum field. You know, in the old days, they used to call it the ether or the Akashic field and so on. But, you know, we know what our ancestors, you know, are basically, you know, call this. and it was Nu and Nonet and Hey and Hayet and Kirk and Kirket and Amun and Amunet, showing that it was this darkness that was infinite and eternal, but conscious and capable of everything. So it was omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. And that's the basis of who we are. We're a part of that. We're not simply the physical presence or the mindset that relates to the physical presence, through the brain and the body and the sensations. And we'll never be satisfied with that. And therefore, we have to go back to our original understanding of who we are as human beings. How do we become true human beings as opposed to being human animals? And I think that's the whole self-knowledge piece that you're saying and directing us towards. But now, Linda, it's not easy.
No, it's a developmental process. So, okay. But as long as we know that there's a way of being in the world in which we've been socialized that's less than optimal, because it's the birthplace of injustice, racism, sexism, classism, ageism, all kinds of dysfunction, to say nothing of...
I just want to say, I think Bob Marley called it ism schism.
Yes. So that suboptimal mindset is the one that we want to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And we want to shift to an optimal mindset, or a conceptual system, I guess is a way to talk about it, as opposed to a mindset. If all is consciousness, then the system that's going to structure our consciousness is going to be a set of assumptions that we hold, and we may not be conscious of them, but we're holding them, and they're determining not only what we perceive, but how we think about it, how we feel about it, what we do. Ultimately, our experience is determined by those assumptions and principles that we hold in forming our perceptions. And what you just described, Dr. Garvey, is the assumptions and principles we hold when we're trapped into that fragmented suboptimal view that has us seeking peace and finding none, has us so materially focused, we get some, we want more. We get the promotion, we're on top of the world. Somebody else gets a better promotion, we're depressed. Just up and down, up and down. That sense of self and constant flux is not healthy. And it doesn't bring peace, and it doesn't bring happiness. And as you said, the more you get, the more you want. And you never get enough, and you're feeling like you're on a treadmill in a rat race, when in actuality, the contemporary notion of mindfulness says, step back. But our ancestors had a cultural worldview that was inherently mindful, inherently positioned from a place of intuitive and instinctive awareness that they were one with the source of all good, and thereby intrinsically worthy. And that peace couldn't come from anything derived externally. In fact, once we have peace, then we create. Peace really becomes the key sensory perception that gives us access to our creativity. Because you can't really be creative if you're anxious and stressed and depressed, or what you create will probably end up being destructive. So the idea that we have two worldviews, two conceptual systems, two mindsets, one suboptimal, one optimal, one Western-based, European Western-based, and one African-based, is very critical for people to understand, because if we don't begin to make that distinction or see those differences, 99.9% of the time we'll be caught up in the fragmented suboptimal one, because that's the one of socialization. And that's the one that's reinforced in the current social context. And we won't know anything about the worldview, the optimal worldview of our ancestors. I think there's an old dictum that says, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. So the African view was first, and it will be the last view, and it will become, again, the first view. the view of the West, the Euro-Western view, is the newbie on the block. It's probably a snapshot or a finger snap in time relative to the worldview of our cultural ancestry. I like to think about it in terms of a race, and we're on the track of life, and we as Black people are coming up on the European, and it looks as though they're in control, and systemic racism is never going to end. But what we must remember, we are coming up on them, but not because they're ahead of us, because we're getting ready to lap them once again. That is so critical for us to begin to see who we really are in the larger context of humanity. We are indeed the mothers and fathers of all human culture and civilization. And that being the case, and our understanding that is being reinforced by the heights of science across cultural groups, that mindset that we had in the beginning is now, because we've maintained it as African people committed to a knowledge, wisdom, and understanding that does not exist in mainstream Euro-Western culture. And we understand that mindset is something that not only will be our salvation, it will be the salvation of humanity. I don't know if we have time now, but at some point we'll talk about the optimization process, the process by which we can shift from the suboptimal to the optimal. And it becomes a self-fulfilling, self-correcting, self-perpetuating process. But it requires that we gain clarity in terms of making the distinction between the suboptimal worldview we've been socialized into and the optimal view that is the true reality.
Wonderful, Linda. It's been my pleasure to have been involved in this discussion with you. And I think we have tried to clarify that there are two different views of life, if you will, over time. The older one is the Afrocentric view. The newer one is the Eurocentric view. And we've delineated to some extent the differences. And our next go around will be looking deeper into the Afrocentric view. And I look forward to that. It's been a pleasure engaging in this discussion with you and learning so much. And hopefully those who have been listening will have had some degree of clarity. Thank you.
Absolutely true. And we wish for them the best. We can't leave this circumstance without, again, acknowledging our ancestors and giving honor to those through whom we've come who have given us this opportunity. And so hopefully, not hopefully, when we meet once again, we will again pursue the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding that we've been sent here to impart. Thank you so much, Dr. Garvey.
Again, my pleasure, Linda.